So I'll get started by giving a brief overview of the educational system in Germany. We already heard some of it during the presentation yesterday of Matthias and Justina. There are 16 federal states in Germany, and each federal state has got its own education policies. Education in Germany is still predominantly in public hands, but also here policies are changing and the influence of private economic actors is increasing. We have a private education sector also in Germany which is increasing and which is also being subsidized by the state, so the state is actually propagating or supporting the increase of the private sector within education. Also here we have budget cuts and therefore the dependency on private investors within education increases if the public budget decreases. And we can feel that when, for example, in the sociology department, there are less professors, or the sociology department actually transforms that in a way that they attract private investors. So they can only do research when they are able to attract private investors with that research.
Sorry, so from what I understood now, it's that the state is actually promoting private education, right?
Well, on one hand, there are private schools and also private universities which are being subsidized.
Yeah, that's
so in this way, the state is promoting the private sector.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's also some sort of privatization taking place within the public institution.
Okay.
It's the same in Slovenia. You have private schools that are actually financed by the government.
Yeah, well, that's what I don't understand. Why are they subsidized if they're private schools? I mean.
Yeah, because they are made by people who have friends with connections with the government.
At least in Slovenia it was like that.
Yeah, here that's not really the case. I don't know why they do it, but yeah, I mean here the politicians are not really linked to those private institutions directly.
Yeah, in Slovenia it's like there was like a minister that created his faculty, and he got then like a lot of fundings for it.
Okay, so it's a case of interest, but in Germany, I mean, I don't really see except promoting private
maybe
education.
if we look at, there is a tendency to everywhere in the world for that kind of investment and privatization within the education system, and especially since the process of Bologna, it's appear that everywhere it's the same case that we see. We see the states that tend to cut money from within and promote the privatization of the system, but by not clearly stated, but because the state is not, it's not something that is neutral, and now the main framework for them is neoliberalization. So for that, it's really normal that they do that, but they do that against their own interests. If we see it as the government and public sector should be linked or viewed as the same, they are doing at their proper expense.
Yeah.
The idea might also be that the state thinks they might save some money if they, subsidize them with maybe like 60%. So then 40% are still generated through tuition fees at the private institution. Yeah. And they might think that private institutions might provide better quality or might be better at some research or whatever, and that might be good in competition. When the states compete with other states, so then they think, yeah, that might attract some investment or whatever, the typical ideology.
But I mean, if you have something like alternative school models, or something like that, it's good to support that they can build this model and try it. And I think it's not only bad to, if government, I mean, yes, it's not good that they're private, but so maybe they can be
like create an alternative.
When it's
Now, from what I was saying is that they actually are building such institutions, and they're actually trying to, on the one hand, cut their costs, like close other public institutions, and actually subsidize like 60% private institutions, and gradually cutting down on state-funded institutions, and then actually create like a system in America where almost like everything is, you have to pay for it, create the same link with student debt, the student debt bubble you were talking about.
But I think the thing with subsidizing private universities and private schools, I'm not quite sure that was either an EU recommendation or it's like Bologna or something.
Really?
Like that. But it's not that they really choose to do this, but the EU is quite sure.
All right. Yeah, so as I said, faculties that are unable to generate their funds from private investors increasingly get under pressure to close down. Another aspect is that we have an increase in advertising on campus, so you have a lot of billboards, but the university increasingly also rents out spaces for promotional purposes, to some companies to promote, student packages and crap like that.
Sorry, but I see this. I'm really. This is happening. It's been happening in America for quite a while. I mean, there are corporations who actually build or sponsor entire universities. Basically, I think that's what they're trying to do.
Yes, and it's a rather new tendency here. Like 5 years ago or something, the first lecture halls were called after some company's name. So they were sponsoring, so Aldi, the supermarket chain, they were sponsoring a lecture hall. So the lecture hall was called Aldi Hall. It's a bit more.
It's a common practice.
That's what I'm saying.
I gotta admit, my university has 60 different buildings named after different corporations, so our model's already come and gone, and it's just arriving here, so I guess I see where this is working towards.
That's what I was saying.
But it's difficult to communicate to students why advertising on campus is not that great. It's really hard to go against it.
Do you have advertising on the sides of your buses, like shop at this place, and all like other university transports and those types of things?
The university has no buses.
I was just blown away by the idea, sorry. But on the side of ours, it has shop at this place, like everything is advertised on our campus. We have billboards on our campus now. It's
That's what I'm saying. I mean, it's a commodification.
And it actually gets increasingly difficult also for the student union to spread their materials.
Yeah.
Because the chairs, the tables actually inside the Mensa, inside the university canteen, it's outsourced, so it's an external firm responsible for the advertising on those tables.
So if you want to put something, it's a private, you have to talk to that first.
Yeah.
There was like a huge billboard on our faculty for philosophy, but after students had some, had some complaints about there shouldn't be like H&M billboard on a faculty of philosophy, then they took it down.
But actually it was because they were renovating the facade of the faculty. It wasn't there. It wouldn't stay there anyway.
Yeah. Another rather new thing is the bachelor-master system, which was introduced in 2005, 2006. Around that time. Before that, we had a diploma which combined like a bachelor and master together. So we only had this one degree, and there was no selection process between, like we have now between bachelor and master, because not everybody who gets a bachelor is automatically inclined to also study masters. In general, also other selection processes increased. For example, you have the so-called NC, which is the grade you get during your A-levels, which will define what courses you are allowed to take at the university. So the grades increasingly get higher, so it's more difficult for students to qualify, for the holy higher education. Yeah, other selection processes. Yeah, tests, you know, there are also increasingly tests that where people have to write their motivational text to justify why they want to study something, totally nonsense. Yes, stuff like that. Yeah, so tuition fees were introduced in 2005, 2006 in several federal states in Germany, and due to massive protests in the following months and years, they were then abolished again in most federal states, and there are only 2 federal states which still charge general tuition fees, as we heard yesterday already. They are Bavaria and Lower Saxony. But it looks like in the coming months they will be abolished there as well. In Bavaria they had a referendum only a few months ago, successful, and so since significant number, I don't know, they needed a few million people to support that referendum, and they actually reached that. And so now tuition fees will also be abolished in Bavaria. And the Lower Saxony, a different government is now in power, and probably they will abolish it again as well.
Small victory.
Yeah, it is actually on the global level. If you look at it, it's a huge victory, and we hope that this also inspires people elsewhere to keep fighting against tuition fees. And not think, because politicians are always busy telling you, it's normal, just look at, the US, Australia, everywhere they charge tuition fees. But actually it's not true, there are still places where there's free access to education, and it's very valuable to point that out and keep fighting. Yeah. So, brief overview of the history on tuition fees in Germany. Yeah, initially in the 15th century and onwards, when the first universities were founded in Germany, they were very elitist institutions. Very few people only had access to the university, and they also charged fees. But it was more like, when people had nothing else to do, or when they had the free time to learn something, and usually those were just people who had other people who worked for them.
They are aristocracy.
Yeah, they could attend university. Yeah. So back then they already charged fees, and then in the 60s there was a strong student movement also in Germany, and one of their demands was to open up higher educational institutions and establish so-called mass universities. This was one factor what actually led to mass universities, but another significant factor is of course also that the economy was changing, industrialization was slowing down, so the transformation of the economy to a service economy led to an increasing demand also of qualified labor, human capital. Yeah. So yeah, I think we should not forget that it is not just due to the protests, but the protests took place, and then probably people thought, yeah, it might not be such a bad idea, and then they gave in and hoped to calm down the protest movement that way, and at the same time have more human capital. Yeah. So from the 60s onwards, tuition fees were abolished. Why? Right. In the year 1970, right, they were not in the 60s yet. In the 60s, the demand was just put forward by the movement. But in the 70s, the first boycott took place at the Hamburg University, and that first boycott was successful. So, students boycotted fees, and then the university was forced to abolish fees, because you can't charge half of them with fees and the other half don't.
Not to pay.
And you can't you can't discharge or kick half of the students out of the university. So in Hamburg in the 1970 it was successful, the boycott, and the idea spread. So then boycotts also took place at other universities, and bit by bit tuition fees were then abolished across Germany. yeah, then in the 1980s, the neoliberal discourse kicked off, and that led to many social reforms, which destabilized the public welfare system. Not just affecting education, but also healthcare and pensions and so on. And in the 1990s, the introduction of tuition fees was part of the political agenda, and consequently, long-term study fees were introduced. So there was like also a process which started with the introduction of long-term study fees, so that it was agreed that students who study longer than 12 or 14 semesters, they would then have to pay 600 euros or 400 euros, depending on the state, for each additional semester. I think the same is still existing in Austria, and also in some federal states they still charge long-term study fees. So yeah, that was the first step into the introduction of general tuition fees. First they introduced long-term study fees in Baden-Württemberg, next to Bavaria, in 1997. That was like first time some sort of tuition fees were introduced again after they were abolished in the 1970s. And in 2005, the Constitutional Court ruled that the introduction of general tuition fees is not against the Constitution. And that opened the doors for the introduction of tuition fees in also other federal states. So the Conservative Party, together with the Liberals, promoted the introduction of tuition fees, saying that it is just socially just, and that this is just fair because people who go to university, they also profit from it, and so on and so forth. So that also transported a certain understanding of education, and didn't put education into a social context, but rather saw education as a personal investment to be used and on the labor market afterwards. So that's also, that automatically shaped the social discourse on education, and of course it's difficult for movements to then counter this discourse, because our tools are just not the same. And unfortunately, the masses also, they took up this discourse and this understanding of education that you go to university to invest into your own human capital, to then invest your own human capital on the labor market.
The university's initial role has lost its, guidelines. I think that's the problem everywhere.
Yeah, so also in Hesse, the federal state here introduced general tuition fees in winter 2007. And Hesse was the only federal state where they also came up with a brilliant idea to charge non-EU students more. Non-EU students were supposed to pay 1,500 euros per semester, and the others 500 per semester.
Yeah, this is what happens in Romania as well.
And there was an outcry. There were massive protests against tuition fees, but also against this to charge students different fees. Massive protests. Many universities were occupied. Railway stations and highways were blocked. We actually also began, the first blockade took place in Marburg. So at the Hauptbahnhof, right, the central station in Marburg, you have the highway there, right? We run up the highway and blocked it there.
You blocked the highway?
That was like one of the first significant actions we did, and it really pushed the movement, and it really was a very controversial action as well.
When was this?
Just before the introduction, I think.
No, when was this? I mean, a few years ago.
No, it was in 2007 when, when the tuition fees were introduced. So 2006, 2007 was a time when the movement was really strong against the tuition fees. And that type of action also spread. So also in Frankfurt, they began to block highways and stuff. Usually you had a demonstration with a few thousand people, and then you use that opportunity to create a bit of chaos, cat and mouse with the police. until you find a hole and get onto the highway.
How many people? 2,000.
2,000
people.
A few, yeah, thousands of people, yeah. I mean, Marburg is rather small, so here maybe 1,000 people will be enough. But in Frankfurt there were like a few thousand people, so you need a significant number, otherwise the police has you under control. Right. Yeah, so on one hand, these acts of resistance, these acts of resistance resulted in 2,000 people being arrested within just 1 year in Hesse alone, so within in this state. And on the other hand, the protests, because they really lasted long. I mean, initially we had like almost every day some demonstration, then once a week, then maybe a bigger demonstration once a month. But this lasted for several years. And this helped to keep this topic on the public agenda, so politicians were forced to somehow make it an issue and to position themselves, to say, yeah, we are against or for tuition fees. And since the Social Democrats and the Greens, and also the Linke, of course, the left party, they try to portray themselves to be like to care about social welfare and stuff. So they sort of felt forced to also position themselves against tuition fees, which doesn't mean much. You should not trust them just because they say, "Oh yeah, we are also against tuition fees." Because we also saw in Hamburg, the Greens, they were against tuition fees. Then they formed a coalition with the Conservatives, and their tuition fees were not abolished. It only works as long as there are also people keeping up the pressure. Yeah, so as I said, currently we only have general tuition fees in Bavaria and Lower Saxony, but it looks like in Bavaria it's confirmed, but I think also in Lower Saxony now they will soon abolish general tuition fees. If also long-term study fees remains to be seen if that will be abolished as well. So in general, at German universities, there's no differentiation being made between students from different states, because there's 16 federal states. In Rhineland-Pfalz, which is also a federal state, they actually attempted, or they played with the idea to charge out-of-state students fees, while in-state students would be able to go to the university without paying fees. But that wasn't successful because in the end they found out that might be against the constitution to treat students differently. Therefore they didn't do it. So there's no real categorization of students taking place when it comes to charging fees, tuition fees. Nonetheless, students from outside the EU are only allowed to work on the labor market a certain number of days per year. So it's more difficult for them to actually earn money. And they, as said already yesterday, they need to prove that they have an account with at least 6,000 euros, I think it was. Seven.
Or more.
So that in case they get sick, that they can cover everything themselves. And of course that's a barrier for a lot of people. Okay, I think at this stage I will show you a video which we did in 2010, as you can see. Going out to education activists around the world to explain like a bit the situation in Germany and to point out the struggle going on against tuition fees. As you can see, this was 2010, so not everything said here is up to date, but I think the images are still inspiring and interesting. All right. The USBs? Carl? The USB or the audio cable?
The audio cable. USB just for charging.
Okay. So as part of the protest in 2009 as well, we occupied, or some students actually occupied the hall at the social sciences faculty for a few months, or 6 weeks or something like that. And then they changed the environment a little bit. So also the bibliothek sign, was changed into right, and also this painting on the walls, which is still there now, was painted during the occupation. This one. And it says here like Calvin and Hobbes, right? Is the cartoon. And here it says, the mom is saying, life could be much worse, Calvin. And he's saying, but it could also be much better. So that's what they did during the occupation, and it's great to see that it's still there. Why is there no more sound?
Plug in the USB.
Yeah, I think that is.
All right. Okay.
Hallo Welt ist eine Gruppe bestehend aus Studierenden, Eltern und Lehrern in Marburg. Gemeinsam setzen wir uns gegen die zunehmende Privatisierung öffentlicher Bildung und für freie emanzipatorische Bildung für alle ein. Einerseits gibt es neuartige Entwicklungen in Bildungssphären. Uns stellen wir die Demokratisierung der Bildungseinrichtungen und die zunehmende Selektion im Bildungssystem, zum Beispiel durch jegliche Form von Gebühren, große Probleme dar. So wurden bereits 2005 in mehreren Bundesländern allgemeine Studiengebühren erhoben. Andererseits versuchen wir die Strukturen, Ausrichtung und eigentliche Funktion des Bildungssystems zu hinterfragen. Warum haben wir überhaupt ein öffentliches Bildungssystem? Wessen Interessen spiegeln sich in dem System wider?
Von Studiengebühren, aber auch die Folgen des Bürgerkriegs lösen noch. An zahlreichen Hochschulen wird Studiengebühren Innenstädte und auch Hörsäle, tausende Aktive.
Let's put it out. One more.
That's it, Paul.
The volume on the computer's turned up to 145%. If you drop it below and turn it up manually.
No, this is a problem connection within the speaker. I think it's just gone.
That was in Frankfurt. That's on the highway. Yeah, that's like, on the, this is in Marburg. Frankfurt.
Yeah, of course, he's always.
Yeah, so not only tuition fees were introduced, but recently, well, in the past few years, also other tendencies could be observed. An increasing outsourcing policy and privatization of certain parts, for example, cleaning stuff, so that external firms will be hired to clean the university.
The canteen.
The canteen?
Well, not actually the canteen, but you mentioned.
Yeah, the tables. The table, yeah, for advertising, there's an external company. Or also language courses are increasingly, well, there's an increasing presence of private language courses, traveling to Malta or traveling to Ireland or wherever to study languages. Yeah, stuff like that. As we heard yesterday, also the Hochschulrat, this external body, or well, it's an internal body, but it's sort of like disconnected from everything else. Called the Hochschulrat, which is where only external people, which is made up of external people, among others also from industry. That's rather new. There was, I don't know, like 2008 or something. But nowadays also at almost all universities in Germany you can find that. So-called excellence initiatives were introduced. That's also a rather new tendency. So there's one on the national level, but there's also one on the federal state level. Every year there's some sort of competition between different faculties from across the state. So each university, they apply for this competition. They say, yeah, we have this certain faculty which is really excellent. And then they compete with that faculty against other faculties within the state. And those who are really excellent will then get additional funding from the state. So those who are already good get more money, and those who are not so good, well, too bad. But that's also supposed to increase competitiveness on the European level, on the global level, and so on. So it's all embedded in the capitalist system. Rankings is also a rather new phenomenon. Like in 2000 or 2005 or something, rankings were not really that significant, but nowadays almost everything is about rankings. There's a PISA ranking, which is on the European level. There's an institution called the CHE, which is the Center for Higher Education in Germany. And the center is actually made up of the rectors of all the universities. The conference, they have a rectors conference, where all the university rectors in Germany are organized, and a foundation of the Bertelsmann Corporation. Are you familiar with Bertelsmann?
No.
It's like actually one of the biggest media corporation in the world, and they have their own foundation. And they always propagate that foundation to be like working for like the social interests for society as a whole and stuff like that. And that foundation is also part of the CHE, of the CHE, Center for Higher Education. And they regularly suggest certain policies, how the education system should change. And they also propagate the introduction of tuition fees, just like the Rectors' Conference. And they also publish the rankings, like the most popular ranking. There are also other rankings, but those rank, that's like the ranking. So at the beginning of each semester, such a ranking is published, and then students often also look at the ranking, see, which university should I go to and stuff like that. That's a rather new development as well. Yeah, and as I already said, faculties are increasingly under pressure to be attractive for external sponsors. So that's also a rather new development. And it's also written in the law on the state level, in the Hessische Hochschulgesetz, which is the education law a law for higher education in Hesse. And there it's also written that faculties are obliged to attract as much external investment as possible. Yeah. And if they are successful in attracting external investment, then they are also rewarded with a little extra sum from the state. Yeah. So yeah, these are like just some examples to show that the introduction of tuition fees is part of a bigger process, and not just it's not just that. Because unfortunately, a lot of student movements and protests are just reducing the problem to be tuition fees, but there are also many other aspects. Yeah, I just wanted to use this opportunity to also point out our understanding of free education. I actually forgot to mention that I'm sitting here also as part of the free education movement Marburg, which is like a small autonomous group in Marburg. And I'm referring to our understanding of free education. So it's not necessarily the understanding of the student union, because it's made up of different groups, but of the free education movement Marburg. Yeah, so for us, free education is closely related to the actual understanding of education. To us, education primarily enables one to better understand our social environment, as well as our world as a whole. And it is about achieving a better understanding of how things function and correlate within the social context. After all, it is exactly this social context which defines our perception of the world. So therefore, free education is the basis for the emancipation of every human being. And free education does not just describe the absence of tuition fees, but it must also be free of profit-driven and state interests. So tuition fees are only one element in a more comprehensive process, which also results in an increasing de-democratization within universities, and also significantly shapes the public discourse. I already tried to point that out in other parts of this presentation. Yeah, nowadays education is often being seen as a personal investment to boost one's own human capital value, which one then invests on the labor market. And this process is what we often refer to as the commercialization of education. And of course, this cannot only be observed in Marburg, but also in Montreal and in other parts of the world like Dakar, New York, Johannesburg, Santiago. And the commercialization of education itself is part of a more comprehensive process, as I said, and of course this commercialization process also affects other parts of life. So we can see the same commercialization within the healthcare system, for example. It's also currently a big topic in Marburg because we have a university hospital, and which is also being sold, or which was sold to a private company, which runs several hospitals in different cities. And there are also major problems with that. The conditions are worsening, and precarious working conditions and so on. So at least to us, for the free education movement in Marburg, and also for some or most people, I guess, within the General Students Committee, the Student Union, the struggle for free emancipatory education is directly linked with the struggle against the predominant economic system, which is responsible for similar developments as universities and also schools around the world. So that's generally the context in which we see the struggle for free education. Yeah, that's it. Any comments or questions?
So yeah, there is this open knowledge movement that kind of pursues similar goals, except that it's the same. I think it's the same distinction as in open source and free software. The open guys are like more practical and free guys are like more political. So yeah, I held a debate with our faculty about it and about the scene, about the publisher scene, about publishing articles and so on. And yeah, we kind of reached the consensus that we should pursue this kind of goals, like free education. It was at our faculty. It was like open knowledge. It's like that there is like a definition. It's like I don't know, 10 or some 11 points about how the knowledge should be open. Like no economical, racial, or any other discrimination.
Yeah. Although personally, I think there's a difference between education and knowledge.
Yeah,
totally.
of course.
Sorry for not listening to all the presentation, but for what I understood, the fight for free education, especially in our case in Montreal, it was not affecting directly the student because they were not the one who were going to pay higher fees. Then it was more like the incoming generation, because they were the one who would have to face all these measures. Because you are in school for like 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 years, and after that you're done. And I think it is important because in their discourse, education is something really individual. Like you do this to have a job or to have some knowledge, which for later on or stuff like that. But we can oppose why it is important to fight for free education. I think it is that we can give it a common, to make it a common thing. Like it is for the common good, and it's not just you with what you're gonna learn or the kind of job you will be able to attend with your degrees or your masters, stuff like that. So, and I think especially. It is a solidarity measure or a solidarity struggle that we are putting, because we're not fighting for ourselves as they want to told us, like, oh, you want free education because you don't want to pay and you're you're some rich kid that because education is something for the upper class and stuff like that. And at this point, I think we need to put it in the discourse that it is a common thing and it's solidarity. And it's for the little one like Alice.
Yeah, obviously I want to repeat what Carl said, because in this kind of discourse, the neoliberal discourse and capitalist discourse, you obviously see knowledge and education as an individual good. You don't really take it as like you said, the personal investment. You invest in yourself, in human capital. You don't really see it as a part of the social structure that I want to learn, I want to attain knowledge, and then spread it to the other people. You just see it's individual. Just internalizes more just for you. Egotistic.
There is one thing you have to be really careful about when you talk about tuition fees, because actual tuition, because that I think happened in Croatia. They wanted to introduce tuition fees, and then they kind of said, okay, we'll abolish them, but they raised the enrollment fees.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, so there was actually no difference between a tuition fee and an enrollment fee, you know, it just never worked. And even when you say that you pay 260 euros for a semester, that in a way is a tuition fee. I mean, it's not
Free.
I mean, and you said that they're actually increasing, but you know, if you cover them under the name of like necessary expenses or just enrollment fee, you know, you can really convince a lot of people that you actually don't have tuitions, or that you know that it's just some extra things. So. And I think that once you introduce tuitions, it's really hard to get rid of them in any case or in any form. You know, once you have them, it's they say, okay, they're not any tuition fees, but you know they find another way to actually charge you each year more.
You're talking about masking the tuition fees,
yes,
but
exactly.
in the case of Marburg, you actually see in reality that in that specific payment that you have to make, you have real benefits. And real, I mean, you actually use the train whenever you want to, and I think that's really important.
So the 260 or something euros, it includes the semester ticket, which is the public transportation, and it also includes a fee for the student union, and it also includes, I think, for the Studentenwerk, yeah, which is in charge for the canteen and stuff. I think you're being charged a fee for that, and the amount usually changes because the contract with the public transport company changes. So yeah.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm saying that it's often masked under the different names, so that's why I can.
Here you have 50 euros, which you charge for administration fee, which is part of these 260 euros.
I agree with that. Also, I think it is kind of problematic to have like a public transport funded by students mandatory. I think it's, of course, you do have a benefit, but I think it's kind of problematic.
You have the option to also get the money back for the ticket.
And that's good.
If you can prove that you don't need it, you know, if you can prove that you stay in another city, or no, you don't, then you actually need it. But if you can.
If a bike or
Yeah, well, I think you need to prove that you have no money, that you need the money for the ticket, and you can prove that you're not in Marburg, if you're like have a semester elsewhere.
Even in Marburg, you don't need public transport.
Yeah, but that's the solidarity idea. You know, it only works if with a company, with a public transport company, if you can tell them that there's a majority of students also paying this amount. So in the end, all of the students, for relatively little money, have the opportunity to travel within Hessen.
Yeah, that was but my actual question was, are there any initiatives against the NC, the most classes thing? Because for us in Austria, this is like incredible. The grade you achieve in your A levels actually determines what you can study if you're actually able to go to university. I mean, this is current.
Yeah. Currently not that at all. But in the past, last big protests were in 2009, 2010. It's called the Bildungsstreik, the education strike, and the NCs was a significant part of the protest as well. Tuition fees and NC. So yeah. But since then, not really. People see it as part of the merit system. So as long as people are working hard, they get what they deserve, it's deeply ingrained in the thinking of many people. So they see it to be just fair if only those who prove to be smart, intelligent, are then.
It's very selective process.
Yeah.
You have like some exams and they determine what you're allowed to study and what not. And you don't have the NC in all study fields, right? Like, for example, I mean, in physics you don't have it.
Here.
Yeah, not anything.
No, you do. I think by now even, I mean, also social sciences has the NC. By now, almost everywhere.
And do you have a quota system like in medical in the faculty, like there are like certain quotas and then students have to go through the entrance examination to get in, or it's like it's totally free no matter like how many students wants to study that faculty, or is there certain quotas?
No, there's no quota really, but that is managed through the NC.
Mm-hmm.
So if you see that there are a lot of students who might want to study something, then you just increase the NC and therefore make it more difficult for students to
Get in?
to study at a certain faculty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably those who enter are the ones who did pass the NC. So they don't have really a reason to go to Finland, because those who don't, they have to leave, they're forced to leave Germany instead.
And is there like different fees as a long-term student for international students and for German students, or is the same one?
Well, that depends on the federal state.
Mm-hmm.
Each federal state has its own policies regarding long-term study fees. In Marburg, we don't have them.
So, in the States, I feel like we're a bit down this road, a lot further than kind of where you're at the moment. But students out of state pay, what, $11,000 a semester as compared to $5,000 a semester for in-state students. Then on top of that, you have fees somewhere between $200 and $300. So it's funny because they managed to stratify not only where you come from, how you approach those things, but also we have long-term study fees. If you go over 4 years, you start getting charged another extra 30% per class. And it's so normal because I think you're right in saying discourse is this self-investment kind of narrative. That, oh, well, they're investing in themselves. And then this is largely because they don't see it as a public good. So a self-investment as compared to a public good is kind of the conflict in terms of ideas. But I'm glad that you all have managed to fight back a good bit of them, that you had a movement. It's a bit difficult oftentimes in the States because the turnover rate's so fast that by the time you start a movement, they're going to graduate by the time the semester's out. You need to find new people to take their place. I'm curious though, how do you all frame the discourse in that way? How do you talk, rather throw out the self-investment thing and start talking public good, public rights?
What do you mean how? I mean, we had a call to action, and there we explained it.
And everyone just came.
I think people still believe that education should be accessible to everyone who deserves it. Yeah, I think this is the mainstream perception of how education should be like. Personally, I also don't like the deserve bit part, but that's how the mainstream, the average person on the street probably thinks about it, I guess. So this is actually a good basis to fight against tuition fees, because tuition fees is a social barrier and it's not that accepted yet. There's still a significant number of people who reject it, and if we wouldn't have that, then it would have been pretty much impossible to successfully fight against it. But also the referendum in Bavaria, which was rather recently, shows that there's a significant number of people in the population who reject the idea of selecting people based on their financial needs.
That's the whole basis for our way of life over there, so I guess it's a bit different,
but nonetheless, you still have this discourse that it's to be seen as a personal investment. That also people here think that way, but still I think it's still sort of unfair to charge people money to invest in themselves. Because those who have no money, how are they supposed to invest in themselves? So it's unfair.
I guess in the States, the only way you can invest in yourself is financially, in the discourse at least. That's how they frame it. But I see your point to that.
Yeah, but in the States they don't have this problem. Oh, it's unfair to, I don't have any money. I don't think they have it.
Oh no, we don't talk about class. You have to blush if you bring it up.
Yeah.
And you try and like not look people in the eye when you
It's
talk
not
about
a
it.
big deal, yeah.
It's not a thing. But the commercialization process, how it seems like that's becoming more at the forefront than the tuition issue to a degree, because billboards, the hospital you were referencing, how do students interpret that in terms of discourse? I'm curious.
The public doesn't really see the other problems, I would say, within the education system.
Yeah, they always see the tuition.
Yeah, the tuition thing is like the only thing where people really get emotional, and really get involved. But regarding healthcare, for example, there's much more anger within the public, I feel. Regarding the privatization of the hospital we have here, people are much more passionate about it because it's health, and it affects everyone pretty much, not just students. So, yeah, I think there the resistance is stronger. Although not on the streets, but in the minds of people.
Yeah, well, it's important to even wage a war, on the minds of the people first. When you make the call to action, you actually get, when you start when you try to spark it, the fire starts. Because you already had the basis, just spreading the idea, the discourse. But what is the method to do this? What's the best method? Because look at it, we hear about it.
We have to communicate it. I think that the personal way is like the most effective in a way of persuading people.
So directly talking to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Because
that's a lot of manpower.
people don't usually emancipate themselves.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but that's a lot of manpower and a short time, because as Ryan pointed out, it kind of evolves rapidly, and if you take it the person at a time, I don't know the best method, the best tactic.
And we were only successful in the struggle against tuition fees because other parts of the society were also on our side. So we had school students also supporting us, we had parents supporting the movement, and only that way we actually managed to fight tuition fees. But in the struggle against the comprehensive development, the development as a whole, we didn't really move forward.
Because it's more complicated to do so. Or you can put it this way, you have to create a concept or the idea as a whole and present it in such an emotional way as the tuition. But, I don't know. We should use like advertising.
Free education should be a billboard.
Alex, you have been talking about some free schools in Serbia, or?
Oh yeah.
So,
I've kind of read about them, and actually I've seen a few talks about free schools in Serbia and in other places, I think in Argentina. And well, the way they worked was actually all voluntarily. I mean, really professors from different universities in Serbia actually took up and gathered. They actually, it was an occupied space, and it was an abandoned university. They occupied it. The students occupied it. They actually renovated it, in time. And then they kindly asked, academics, etc., to come and actually give lectures there. So it wasn't something like accredited, or I don't know, they give you a diploma at the end of the course and stuff like that. But it was knowledge sharing.
Maybe it might be a good way for like alternative schooling of about education and about the student struggle that should took place among students themselves, like self-organization.
Yeah, but it's very hard because they actually consider that paying a service is much more comfortable than actually producing the service for everyone else, you know. I mean, I'd rather go and, okay, give me the hamburger than actually cut the bread, put the meat, and this. It's easier, you know.
But it takes a lot of time. People don't have the time.
People don't have the time because, you know, money, the capitalist system, so.
So that's why I think also such free universities, they're rather seldom. You know, I think in Melbourne you have one, and then there's also one in Liverpool or something. But they're very seldom because they depend on a few people who do almost nothing else than run the free university.
And I don't know how efficient are they, but you need it in like numerous, mass numbers.
We have one in the States actually, but it's a Quaker school. Quakers are the ones who get away with doing everything fun and cool before it was cool.
Quakers did it.
Quakers were doing it before it was cool, I assure you. But all the students have to put in 20 hours worth of work, and that's your tuition every week. And it's a farm-based university, so they oftentimes sell the produce to pay the faculty. They actually created a pretty sophisticated system.
Okay.
It's the only one I know of, though.
Is it in San Francisco?
No, the one I'm referring to is Warren Wilson in Asheville, North Carolina, but there is one in San Francisco I know. They're known for being free and leftist, both of those.
Quaker.
I don't think San Fran is Quaker.
No, how do Quakers position themselves in?
They're actually in front of all the radical movements.
Yeah.
Anti-war, pro-environment, all that.
Well, there you have it.
Okay, so should we have like a 10-minute break and then continue with Sri Lanka?
Yeah.